Hi everyone, and welcome to the second panel of the Sydney Science Trail, Australia Fires, the impacts and opportunities. I'd really like to thank you for joining us. My name's Denise Ora and I am the Chief Executive of the Botanic Gardens Greater Sydney, and that's made up of the Royal Botanic Garden Sydney, the Australian Botanic Garden at Mount Annan, which is Australia's largest botanic garden, and also our beautiful Blue Mountains Botanic Garden in Mount Tomah, which got really severely impacted in our conservation space during the bushfires. I'm really excited to welcome you to our panel discussion on the very important and relevant topic about bushfires. But firstly, I'd like to pay my respects to the first people of this nation and their custodianship of land, sea and sky, and acknowledge them as the first scientists of these lands. This country always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce you to a wonderful scientist, Joe White, who is my Director of Science, Education and Conservation here at the Botanic Gardens Greater Sydney. And I hope you have a fabulous time and I hope you really enjoy the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denise, for the warm welcome. Lovely words, thank you. I'm super excited too, and I think the panel today will be fantastic. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today to discuss the Australian fires, their impacts and opportunities. Many people refer to the last summer as unprecedented in terms of the bushfires that we saw and the impact of those fires. And I think it's really great timing for us to, through Science Week, to explore the impacts and the opportunities. And we're really, really lucky today. We've got a fabulous panel. We've just been chatting earlier, and it's a very diverse group with very different perspectives that we can bring to the discussion today. So I'm super excited. A few housekeeping things. So in terms of if you've got a great question, a burning question, you could say, if you could share those questions, and if you're thinking of those questions during the discussion, if you can ask your teacher to put them into the Q&A, and then we're going to come back and see how many of those we can answer at the end. And I'll really be ably assisted by Tori Tasker, who is going to come back in for the last 10 minutes. So the first half an hour, we'll go through a discussion with the panel, and then we'll come back in for Q&As. The session is being recorded, but don't worry, it's just the panelists that are on camera. And speaking of panelists, we've got a fabulous 3 speakers today, and I'd like to introduce each in turn and ask them to give us a few minutes about what they do in their work and how it relates to fires. So let's get into it. So I'm going to introduce Rachel first. Rachel Kavanagh is the Director of the Indigenous Working Group at the Forest Stewardship Council of Australia, and has amazing experience and background. And I would like to hand to you, Rachel. And if you can give us a little bit of your work and then how it relates to fires as introduction, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Jingi Walla, everyone. My name is Rachel. I am a cultural fire practitioner for Curry Country, which is up on the very far north coast of New South Wales. And I'm also a full-time firefighter as well. So I was a part of the 2019-2020 fires, which we saw, you know, some pretty horrific things happen. But I'm also specialise in traditional land management practices. So, you know, a little bit later on, we'll touch base on all of those types of things. So enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. David, so we'll go to you next, David. David is Professor David Cohen, a distinguished research scientist at the Centre of Accelerator Science at ANSTO. And if anyone out there has an interest in physics as a career, he's the man to ask today. Put your questions through. So David, over to you.
Good, thanks. I'm David Cohen. I'm a physicist at the Centre for Accelerator Science at ANSTO, which is the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, just south of Sydney, down at Lucas Heights. I actually went to school at a local high school in Cronulla, and then on to Sydney University and did physics. So if you're interested in that, I can recommend it as a career. We operate particle accelerators out at ANSTO, and they're very good at measuring very, very small masses. masses of the order of 1 millionth of a gram, which is very small. And this turns out to be very useful for air pollution studies. And as you all experienced back in late last year and early this year, we had bushfires. So we can use these accelerators to quantify and measure the extent and what's actually in smoke within the bushfires. A lot of you don't realize that a lot of valuable soil is also lifted up and taken into the air when you have bushfires as well. So hopefully we'll have a good time. I'm looking forward to the discussion as we move forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. And the third person on our panel, and somebody who works close to my own heart, is Dr. Mark Uy. He's a Senior Research Fellow at the University of New South Wales and also a member of the Bushfire Risk Management Research Hub. And I say that because he has a strong, his interest is in plants. Now, we love animals and they do get a lot of spotlight at the moment with the fires, and so they should, but it's great to have someone who can also talk to us about plants today. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I'm a plant ecologist and I'm based at the University of New South Wales, as Joe said. So I'm interested in looking at plants and how they persist and how they function within the natural environment. And of course, in Australia and in many other parts of the world, fire is a big part of that natural environment. And so we have a research group here that looks at everything from down to the nitty-gritty of looking at how seeds germinate in response to fire, up to how whole vegetation communities can persist under different fire regimes. And so the work itself, quite practically, we can be out in the bush and sometimes even implementing burns to see how the plants respond. And we can also be in the lab running experiments, sometimes even wearing lab coats, but that's a bit of a rarity. And doing analytical work as well at the desk. So we sort of cross across a few different skills to look into fires and plants.
Wonderful, thank you, Mark. I'm actually going to go to you. We'll move now to some questions, and these are exploring those major themes of impacts and opportunities. So I'm going to go to Mark first and ask him, what is fire ecology? So if you can share that with all our listeners or watchers. And then if you looked at the impact from the 2019 fires, what do you think have been the impacts on plants and animals, Australian plants and animals?
So ecology, very broadly, is looking at the interactions between biotic and abiotic factors. It's also the demography. So just like us humans, plants and animals have a demography. They have births and deaths and marriages and everything in between. And so we look at those interactions. You can have, obviously we know that flowers have pollinators that are insects. They grow in soil, and there's a whole lot of mechanisms going on between all of those different strata. And in Australia, as I said before, we have fire that lays over the top of all of that. So a lot of what drives the demography and the persistence and the dynamics of our plants and plant populations is fire. So just as a quick example, there's some seeds that we have. So plants will grow and produce seeds over time. Those seeds will then be stored in the soil seed bank, and they'll sit there dormant, sleeping essentially, until a fire comes through. When the fire comes through, there'll be some cues related to that fire. So there's heat from the passage of fire, or the smoke will have chemical cues that then get those seeds to germinate. So fire ecology, and that's just one very small example, is this overriding discipline of investigating or researching these kinds of interactions. As far as the impact of the fires this year, as Joe said, they're unprecedented in the scale. So you think just in New South Wales, there was well over 5 million hectares burnt, and there was a lot of areas that are commonly burnt, such as heathlands and woodland type vegetation types. Around 50% of those were burnt, but also we had areas burnt that aren't usually subject to fire, or at least not very often. So some of the rainforest areas, around 30 or 40% of rainforests were also burnt. In amongst that, there was around 300 threatened animal and around 700 threatened plant species. And the fire, or a fire itself, for those plant species isn't necessarily a bad thing, because all the plants and animals are adapted to a particular fire regime. So how often you're burnt, what time of year or what season you're burnt in, and how intense the fire is. But what's quite different and interesting about this year, and potentially worrying, but we have to monitor and see, is that the extent of these fires were so large, and they were of such an intensity over such a large area, that it's going to take some monitoring to really get an understanding of what the impacts were. And I guess if this whole panel is about both the pluses and minuses of what we've just seen, one way understanding what the capacity is for some of these species to persist under such extremes is one of those.
Wonderful. Great answer, Mark. Rachel, I'm going to go to you next, and interested to know, why do we need to understand the link between plants, ourselves, the land and fire better? Why do we need to understand that link better? Or the link between?
As an Aboriginal person or a First Nations person from this country, we have always had fire in the landscape. I think that's something that we need to understand, that it, like what Mark said before, fire has always been here, and it's the connection of that fire and the plant species and the environment as a holistic view is how and why we use cultural fire practices. And I think that story is really important to tell. It's not something that should be feared. Fire is good, smoke is good, but it all depends on how that comes. And you know, the fire season we've just lived through is just something that has been horrible for our environment, plants and animals, and also. But it's also brought in the conversation around cultural fire practices and how we have always lived in sync with fire in our Australian landscape, and how using those types of fire techniques can actually help bring back, you know, if we used or embraced those things with Aboriginal communities, we can actually engage a little bit better with different fire methodology in the landscape, and that does in then turn help with everything else. So yeah.
Terrific. I'm just going to explore a little further there, Rachel, in terms of your work. What have you seen as the impacts on the forests that you're helping manage?
It's been really hard, actually. It's, as an Aboriginal person with a strong cultural connection to the land, the fires we've just witnessed have been some of the hardest things that we can see. We've had whole landscapes have changed, whole ecosystems have changed, and I think it's going to be a really, really long time for the bush to recover and come back. And I don't think it's going to come back in its natural form. There'll be other issues around that. So that's been really challenging, I think. And also as a cultural fire practitioner, so we're putting in very different sort of fire methodology in the cooler months, but due to other things that come in, whether it's climate change, whether it's drought, whether it's other environmental impacts and issues, create such a huge wildfire event that we've had, which then in turn changes everything else. So it's all of that. It's really sort of, it's hard to see, but you know, there's some strategies forward, I think, and this out of all of this negativity, there are some positive things. So yes.
Yeah, terrific. I can see both myself and Mark nodding there, saying it's going to take a while and monitoring. We're all on the same page. Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm going to go to David next. And I think one of the things that everybody, a vast majority across Australia experienced with the fires was poor air quality. And it's certainly been very topical since. David, what does your research tell us about the impact of the fires and if we relate that to air quality?
Good, thanks. Yeah, look, we have fires in Australia, every year. We've had them for tens of thousands of years. But I think it's important up front to put this particular event in the last 2019-20 summer season that we had. 2019 was the hottest and driest year on record, and you've heard about climate change. The 2019-20 fire season, it started very early. We had 50 fires burning in September, which was fairly early for the fire season. And by January to 2020, 21% of all forests in Australia had burnt, 21%. And some 18.6 hectares were burnt overall with the fire season. And 2 million people were directly threatened by the fires, and there were some 34 deaths. This was quite a major event. 2,800 homes were lost, and 1.8 million people were forced to evacuate. And if you go and look at the health impacts, some 60% of Australians reported being affected by smoke. Now, there are actually no real fires in the Sydney Basin, but the Sydney Basin, as we all know, is quite covered in smoke. And from the pollution point of view, the air pollution in Sydney hit peaks of 8 times the New South Wales EPA goals. And if you go out to Goulburn, it was actually 40 times the recommended goals there. So it's quite hazardous in terms of human health. In fact, the New South Wales Health Department, it predicted there'd be 400 deaths in the eastern states as a result of these bushfires. There'd be 1,000 additional hospital admissions in cardiovascular conditions and 2,000 hospital admissions for respiratory conditions. So I know I've quoted a lot of facts and figures there, but what I want to get across is just how large these fires were and how significant they were. And one of the things that you get from bushfires and pollution are things called fine particles. They call them, you've probably heard it on the news, PM 2.5. That's particulate matter with diameters less than 2.5 microns. Now, micron is a millionth of a meter. You can put 100 of these particles across the diameter of a human hair. That's how small they are. You can't actually see them, but you breathe them deep into your lungs and they have health effects. And one of the things we can do out at ANSTO on our accelerators is we can analyze these particles very quickly, very easily. And we've been doing it for 20 years, more than 20 years. And one of the things you find about air pollution is it's not just smoke. We have all sorts of constituents. We have pollution from cars. We have pollution from fossil fuel burning for power stations. We have emission industries, industries that emit. Even ships come into your harbour. They have big diesel motors and burn. We have biomass burning, which is bushfires, but you also have dust storms. We've had huge dust storms in Sydney as well. And the fires that you see, there's actually 2 types of fires, which people probably don't understand. We have the bushfires, which we're all aware of, but also in Sydney Basin, people actually burn wood for domestic heating. And it turns out that's quite a significant polluter as well in the wintertime. In fact, 60 to 80% of the fine particle pollution in Sydney is people burning wood for heating in fires in the western suburbs. So you've got to put all this together and you've got to understand it. And that's one of the things that our research does. It looks at what the air pollution is, it looks at the health effects, and it looks at how we can mitigate it, where we should put our dollar to control it. So some of the things that you've heard from the other 2 speakers are very important because we don't want to spend a lot of money on trying to clean up air pollution in one area, say from cars or from coal-fired power stations, if in fact the main contributor is people with domestic heating or bushfires. So that's what we focus on at ANSTO, is understanding the total package of air pollution. And I guess the other point to make is to try and put it into perspective. The average person, if you're not running marathons, breathes 30 cubic meters of air a day. And what that means is they're breathing in, roughly in Sydney, 300 microns of pollution into their lungs. And that's not very much, but it has direct access to your bloodstream and it can have health effects on people. The average levels in Sydney are between 6 and 8 micrograms per cubic metre. I know it doesn't mean much to you at this stage, but the health effects say that it should be less than 25. So 6 to 8 is not too bad. If you go to some Asian cities, if you travel, which we can't do with COVID at the moment, some of their annual averages are up around 50 or 60 micrograms per cubic metre. So they have large health effects. So understanding air pollution that we do at ANSTO is very important, understanding its health effects. And there are many other things as well. We've heard about climate change and the long range transport. And I've got to say that these fires that we had, they don't just sit in the Sydney Basin. They went over New Zealand, they went right around the globe. It took them 3 weeks to go around the globe, and we're still measuring them. They're coming back over Australia again afterwards. So we have global impacts when we have major fires in Sydney.
Thank you, David. That was a wonderful summary of the impacts, and really good for us to actually understand how much they're impacting our human health. I'm going to turn the panel to the question of opportunities. We've kind of been exploring impacts. So I'm going to go to you, Rachel. And can we successfully live with fire? Or is it rather a case of healing the environment to make it less fire prone? So what do you see as our opportunities?
I don't think it's about healing the environment to make it less fire prone. I think we've all touched base before in our questions that fire has always been in our landscape. So I definitely think that there's the opportunity to be able to heal our country and our environment by using fire, and that's implementing the right fire methodology and techniques into caring for our environment. So I think we need to look at how we manage our country, or how we manage the forest and the bush, and what our intent is when we do go to put this fire into the landscape, I suppose. Because this time last year I was fighting crown fires already. So like we were 3 weeks into our fire season, which is just like ridiculous. But what we need to understand is we weren't able to put in a lot of cultural burning or hazard reduction burning prior to our fire season, because it started in winter, and that was due to drought and all of the other things. So due to the other environmental impacts, if you can't put in different techniques or different method like fire regimes in to prevent for wildfire suppression during fire season, you've got all of this buildup of fuels and all of that sort of stuff in the environment. So what we saw last year, we couldn't do any pre-burning, and then we hit we had drought, we didn't have rain and all of that sort of stuff, and then it just was so hot and all of the rest, and history is history, we all know what happened. But if we can use every opportunity that we can in our changing environmental landscape and put in the right type of fire methodology into country, we will get better outcomes. It isn't the only answer, but it is a way to start changing the way we view our environment and what it means to us. So Aboriginal people would burn and put fire into country for a number of different reasons, but caring for it was number one. So if you look at it from an agency perspective or something like that, when they put fire in, they're doing it to minimize wildfire suppression and to look at minimizing the risk if wildfire was to come close to assets, infrastructure, communities, and all of that sort of stuff. So their fire techniques are very different, and why they want to burn are very different. So I think we need to change our discussion around how we manage land holistically, and fire is just one tool in that bigger picture that we can change to help manage country over a longer period of time. And cultural burning does take time. It's not as easy as, in a quick answer, but it definitely is one way that we can do it. And the landscape will respond because that's what it knows. So I think, they're the opportunities, and it's the opportunity for First Nations people to be able to actually stand up and lead in this space because they hold the local knowledge. So, yeah.
Fabulous. Are you getting to do that? Is that
Yeah.
that part of the conversation that started?
Yeah,
Fantastic.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so pleased to hear that. That's great. Thank you, Rachel. Wonderful. Mark, I'm going to go to you in terms of the opportunities. What can we learn from these fires, and what do you think it means for our future management?
As Rachel was saying, I think understanding different types of fire that we put in. Someone says different fire for different country, and I think that's an important thing. Understanding what the burning that we're putting into the system is for. But also, as Rachel said, I agree that there's not one solution. One of the things we think of, I think, with fires, if you think of fires as a hazard, it's part of our natural landscape, but then if you put people and infrastructure in there, that's where the hazard lies. And I think we still see that we are able to control fire as a hazard. We don't think we can control a tsunami or we can control an earthquake. We build things so that they withstand those things. And so I think maybe we have to think about that for some. That's more on the infrastructure kind of side. From the plant ecological side, what we can learn, I think one thing we can learn is how much of an impact things like climate change are having. I think this is one of the first real views to, well, not even to the future now. One of the aspects and one of the projections made about fires and climate change is interval squeeze. So that means more and bigger fires happening more regularly. So that in itself might not sound that positive, but what we can do from that, and again, I go back to monitoring, is we can see what the capacity is for the species that are there. How can they persist? Do they persist under extremes? And I'm sure there's going to be some that will, but I'm also sure that there's going to be some that will struggle. And then identifying which of those that are going to struggle is where we might have to have a closer look at more interventionist type things. I think interventionist type management is probably the last bit we really need to look at. But again, yeah, as was said before, if there's, say, a particular threatened species over a smaller area and there's things like weeds, like feral herbivores coming in, they're the sorts of things we might have to think about at a small scale. And also probably on a bigger picture, if there is anything we can do, we can think about if frequent and more frequent fire is the future, there are still some things we can do to maybe put in place. So obviously most of the ignition sources were from natural lightning strikes from this fire season, but there are some from infrastructure ignition sources, and we can do a lot more, I think, in trying to control for those as well. So that's probably another whole area of science, and possibly an area more for the physicists and the engineers, but it's something I think we could look into.
Well, thank you, Mark. That was a lovely cross there for David. I'm getting a message from Tori that some great questions are coming in, so we've probably got just a couple more minutes, and then we're going to go to our Q&A. So, David, a big finish for the panel before we move into the Q&As. What do you see as the learning and the opportunities coming from the fires, from your point of view?
Well, I guess with the research that we do, we try and take a big holistic approach. We look at the inputs and the outputs. And the inputs really for air pollution, it's driven by urbanization. More and more people are going into cities, and as you go into cities, the cities get bigger. They move out into bushland areas, and you have more impacts when there's fires. But they also generate more pollution within the cities. That's a sort of input thing. And then the output is, well, when you have pollution, what are the effects? And really there are three key effects that we want to do to better understand so we can work out how to mitigate these effects. And the first one is on health. And I've already mentioned that people die prematurely because of air pollution. And the New South Wales health people say, independent of the fires, even if you haven't got them, on average, 420 people a year die prematurely from air pollution in New South Wales. So it has an effect. So we need to understand what it is, what component of that air pollution is having those effects. The second thing is we want to use long-range transport to see where the pollution goes and what effects it has. We know that we had no fires in the basin, as I mentioned, the Sydney Basin, but it still came into the basin where 5 million people live. So we need to understand what time of the year it comes and how it's transported. And that's not just locally, it's regionally. If you go up to Asia, you get stuff coming out of China, goes into Korea and Japan and all around the globe, as I've already mentioned. So understanding the long-range transport of these things is also important because it affects other populations. And the third thing that's been mentioned a little bit is climate change. Now, everybody knows about greenhouse gases and the warming, but the warming from greenhouse gases is about 2.5 watts per meter squared, the sunlight coming in. That's positive. Particles that you get from fires and emissions from all the things I've mentioned so far, the fine particles, they actually scatter the light back out from the sun. And they have a cooling effect. And they have a cooling of about minus 1.5 watts per meter squared. So you get this cancelling of warming and cooling and climate change. So understanding things like bushfires and things that emit large amounts of particles is very important in the process of climate change. So those three things: health, climate change, and long-range transport, are what we're working on, and how we can mitigate the effects of them all.
Wonderful. It's been such an interesting discussion, and as I said from the beginning, such a range of diverse views and not diverse views, diverse background, and bringing all that to share to the panel. So thank you. I think we've probably got questions flooding in, and I'm going to cross to Tori to see what questions we've got that people are keen to get answers for.
Great, thanks so much, Jo. We do have quite a few questions coming in, particularly for Rachel, about your experience as a firefighter. We've got a question from another Rachel at St. Catherine's School in Waverley, and they'd love to know about your journey to becoming a firefighter, kind of what made you want to become a firefighter, and did you kind of encounter any setbacks along the way?
So I've always had an interest in fire. I've been fortunate to grow up around cultural burning, but I think it just came with the job. I applied to be a ranger, a wildlife ranger many years ago, and a part of that was firefighter training and to be a forest firefighter. So that's sort of how it came about. And my first season on, I absolutely loved it, and I've pretty much stayed in it ever since. Setbacks, yes, there's been a few different setbacks, I suppose, but the biggest one is it's a very male-orientated role. So I think it's, I'm always advocating for more females, more female firefighters out there with me anyway, because a lot of the time I'm just out in the field with all men. So it's a job we can all do.
Great, thanks, Rachel. We've got a couple more about being a firefighter, if that's all right. Yeah. Kind of our kids would like to know, if you come across a living animal while you're out firefighting, do you kind of have to help them, or how do you go about that situation?
Yeah, definitely. If it's in my ability to be able to help wildlife, we definitely do. A lot of the time, with the wildfires coming in as bad as they were in 2019 and 2020, if the animals already know and have a sense, so they're sort of getting out of the way prior to, but those fires moved really quickly. So there was, as we all know, we lost a lot of plants and animals in that space, but we also had the ability to be able to rescue some as well. So yes, that's the short answer is yes, you do save what you can, as long as your safety and other people's safety isn't at risk.
Absolutely. And would you be happy to share any personal kind of consequences or impacts of becoming a firefighter?
Yeah, I think I'm a single mum. So my daughter is 8, and she's a cultural fire practitioner. This little kid of mine knows fire through and through. She knows the difference between good smoke and bad smoke, and the different colors of it and what that all means for the environment and all sorts. But the biggest barrier I had this year was, like I said, I was fighting fires from early July through to February. And that's a lot of time away from my girls, a lot of time. And, you know, we were covered in smoke for pretty much most of that here up at Coffs Harbour. And for them, it was hard because they knew that it was bad smoke. The fires were really bad. My daughter's asthmatic, so she was home from school a lot, and mum wasn't home because I was out fighting the fires. So that would probably be the biggest barrier, the biggest challenge that I have personally, is leaving my family and knowing that my daughters understand fire. So our conversations were very, they were quite confrontational, I suppose, as a mother. So yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that, and of course, thank you for what you do as well. To change a bit of tact, over to David, we have a question for you, and it's not about fires specifically, but it's about what inspired you to go into physics overall.
Yeah, well, I went, as I say, to the local high school, and I was inspired by mathematics to start with. And when I went through, we had 5 years, not 6. We went to the Leaving Certificate. I'm a real old fogey. And I enjoyed doing maths. It was something that I seemed to be good at, something that I understood. And so I followed it. And I think the most important thing in all of this is follow what you enjoy and what you really want to do. And then I went to university. I went to Sydney University, and I did an honours degree there. And I started to follow maths. But then I started to think, as most people do as they get older, well, where's the job career? Where do I want to be in a job? And it struck me that physics had more opportunities, because this is going back when the space age and we're going to the moon and all this sort of stuff. And so, you know, people were inspired by science and physics that was going on at the time around us. And so I moved in from maths into physics, which is a pretty easy transition at university, fairly flexible, easy to do. And then I got a PhD in physics. And then I went overseas. And I've worked at Oxford University. I've worked in CERN, at the big Large Hadron Collider, on accelerators where they smash atoms into one another and things like that. It's all very exciting. And I was quite inspired. Came back to Australia. And I've been working on accelerators ever since at ANSTO down here in southern Sydney. So my advice for people who want to start careers in science, just if you love it and it turns you on, go for it, because today there are a lot of opportunities in science. And I think science is one of those things that we need a lot more of in Australia. When I went through, you had to go overseas and get a couple of years experience and come back, because it's a bit of a cultural cringe thing about you hadn't been overseas, but I don't think that's the case so much anymore. And we've got science industries and universities here that employ scientists, so I think it's good. And I've had a terrific career in science, still have.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that, David. I think we've just got one last question that I'm going to direct towards Joe and Mark as our plant specialists of the panel. How can our audience kind of help out with any threatened species of plants that are out there, or plants that might not be as so well adapted to fires but have been affected by them?
Do you want to start, Mark?
Oh, yes. Sorry, Joe. I think one thing that we've started up here in our group at the Centre for Ecosystem Science is it's not necessarily about the threatened species, but it's about the recording the recovery itself. So we've got a project called the Environment Recovery Project, and there's a link to it on the iNaturalist website. And what we want is citizen scientists, and that's all of you, that's everybody, to go out there where it's safe and walk around in the bush and just take photos of what you see recovering, and then you can upload them to the Environment Recovery Project through the iNaturalist site. And that's actually giving us data to understand what is recovering and what isn't recovering, for that matter. And the more people that contribute to that, the better the data will be, and the more information we'll be able to get to figure things out. So that's one really practical thing. I've got to emphasize when it's safe to do so, but it really will help, and it will directly link you to understanding the recovery.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I totally agree. I think citizen science is a great way to go, and we're certainly promoting using iNaturalist. So we've got many years, I think, ahead monitoring what's going on. So if you're out in the bush, photos of what's going on and sending those in is helping us understand what's recovering and what's in the landscape. And maybe keep doing your gardening at home and build that passion for plants.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. Jo, I will just pass over to you to wrap us up for today.
Thank you, Tori. I just want to give a big shout out to everyone who's joined us, all you fabulous students and teachers. We love the fact that you love science and wanted to connect. I want to thank our fabulous panels. So thank you, Rachel, David and Mark. Really interesting discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone listening did as well. There's been a great team supporting us today. So thank you, Tori, thank you, Christian, thank you, Bonnie, thank you, Jacob. And the recording, as I understand, is going up at the end of tomorrow on the, it'll be a Dart posting. I'm going to shamelessly plug now the panel that's on for tomorrow on climate change, same time, and really interesting speakers as well. So if we've ignited your interest today in climate change, to take it up tomorrow as well. And just concluding, look, I love National Science Week. It does feel like it goes for a month sometime, but it's such a joy. And if you have an interest in science, please pursue it, and you can find some really interesting careers. So take care.